All right, this next story in A Fine and Pleasant Misery is called The Theory and Application of Old Men. Every kid should have an old man. I don't mean just a father. Fathers are all right, but I'm not knocking them, since I am one myself. But from the kid's point of view, they spend entirely too much time at a thing called the office, or some other equally boring place of work. If you're a kid, what you need is someone who can take you out hunting or fishing, or just poking around in the woods anytime you feel the urge. That's an old man. Doing things like that is what old men were designed for. If you've ever had an old man of your own before, you may not know what to look for or how to use one once you find him. I am something of an expert on the subject, having studied under some of the best old men in the business. Someday, I hope to get into the field myself. In any case, I am eminently qualified to advise you on getting and caring for your first old man. First off, let's consider the problem of identifying old men in the field. All old men are male. This is an important reminder, and even then one can mistake. Occasionally on hunting trips, I have discovered that what I thought were old men turned out to be old women. They had turned out to be young. Had they turned out to be young women, I would have been a good deal less disappointed. But that turn of circumstance almost never happens to me. Here's a good basic description of an old man. He's a male person with white hair, a stubby beard, wrinkled hide, bifocals, long underwear, chewing tobacco, and the disposition of a bull walrus with a bad case of the shingles. If you find a female person with these basic characteristics, she would probably work just as well. Old men come in various vintages. The 60s are good, the 70s are excellent, but the 80s are prime. 90s are fine too, but there is always the risk they won't make it to the punchline on a good story. Every youngster should be properly trained in the safe handling of an old man before he is allowed to take one out alone. One good bit of advice is to treat every old man as if he were loaded. If a kid accidentally triggers an old man, he is liable to get his vocabulary peppered with colorful expressions that will send his mother into shock the first time one tumbles off his tender lips. As a boy, I once addressed a piece of malfunctioning machinery with the appropriately descriptive language of my own old man. Quick as lightning, my grandmother struck, deftly boxing my ears in 1-2 combination. Fortunately for me, she used a small box. "You've been hanging out with that blankety blank old rancid Crabtree," she said. "He just ain't the sort for a blankety blank young boy always be traipsing after. And I'll tell him the next time I lay eyes on the blankety blank." Blankety blank, by the way, was one of Mr. Crabtree's favorite words. The very next time the old man was in our kitchen, old Graham lit into him. He grinned like a shaggy old dog, sitting there dunking a big sugar cookie in his coffee. He was very good at concealing his fear of Graham. Mr. Crabtree, by the way, had a definite aura about him, a presence that seemed to linger on in the house long after he had gone home. Frequently, my mother would comment on it. "Throw open the windows," she would shout. Let us next consider the proper technique for starting an old man. When you're older, you can start an old man simply by loading him, or, the more common expression, getting him loaded, while you're still a kid. However, you will have to use empty old men, who are a good deal harder to start. The best technique for starting an empty old man is called priming. You say something like this to your OM. "Mr. Jenkins, I'll bet I'll bet fishing is sure a lot better nowadays than when you were a kid. That bit of priming should not only get him started, but will keep him going for a couple hours. A kid may come across an old man who gambles, drinks, lies, cusses, chews, and spits, hates to shave and take baths, but there's also a chance that he will run into one with a lot of bad habits. There are two kinds of old men in particular that he wants to watch out for: the sleeper and the drifter. Once you've gone to all the trouble of getting the sleeper started, he will set you up with something like this. So that old sow bar shoos her cubs up the tree, and then she comes for me. I can see she's got her heart set on turning my bride into a whiter woman. Whilst I's ups in my 22 single shot. Yes, yes, go on, you say, go on. Snort, please snore, he says. Sleepers will often drop off like that every time, and you want to avoid them like the plague. The drifter is just as bad as the sleeper, and maybe even worse. Keep in mind that most old men are masters of the art of digression. They will start off something like this. I recollect the time a bobcat got loose in Poke Martin's plain. Funniest thing I ever seen. Old Poke was flying supplies into Pat Doyle's camp at Terrible Creek. Terrible Creek. That's where I got a 20-pound char one time on a piece of bacon ride. Ha! Old Shorty Long and me was running a trap line in winter. About the coldest winter since I got my tongue stuck on that pump handle when I was a youngin'. Back in those days, in this fashion, the average old man will digress back in about the time the Earth's crust was beginning to harden, and then will work his way back to the original topic, touching every base as he goes. A brief anecdote is somehow transformed into the history of Western civilization, but it was all entertaining and enlightening. The drifter, however, just leaves you back there in the midst of time, the two of you looking about, wondering what it was you had come for. But what about the bobcat, you'd ask, hoping to jog the drifter's memory. Bobcat, he says. What bobcat? My own luck with old men over the years has been exceptionally good. I still keep a stable of them around to remind me of the time when men, and women too, were measured not by whether their look was wet or dry, but whether they possessed a mysterious quality called grit. When I was younger, grit was a chief remedy for a variety of ailments. What that boy needs, an old man would prescribe is more grit. A deficiency in grit is considered more serious than a shortage of vitamin B. It was generally felt that you couldn't live life without it. Grit, I've learned over the years, is one of the best things an old man has to offer a kid. That and fine lying, and maybe the proper use of the language. Most of my early language training was attended to by old men. The first person to truly appreciate the value of this linguistic tutoring was my freshman composition teacher in college. He called me into his office and told me that my composition papers were filled with the most outrageous lies ever inflicted on consciousness of a civilian and rational mind, meaning his, and that my spelling, grammar, and syntaxical monstrosities approached an absolute illiteracy. I was embarrassed. I just wasn't used to compliments like that. I thanked him, though, and I realized I could write pretty good all right, but I reckoned I would do better if I put my mind to it. Well, he was dumbfounded to hear that I might even surpass my previous literary efforts, as he gently shoved me out of his office, uttering over and over, "I don't believe it! I don't believe it!" I could tell he wasn't a man who knew anything about grit or old men either. For a long time when I was growing up, I didn't have an old man of my own. I had to borrow one belonging to a friend of mine. The old man was my friend's grandfather, which seemed to me just like about just which seemed to me just about the most convenient arrangement a kid could ask for. Then my friend moved away and left the old man in his entirety to me alone. It was a fine stroke of luck. In the easy informality of the day, the old man called me Bub, and I called him Mr. Hooker. He didn't seem to mind the familiarity. Mr. Hooker was a prime old man. One of the first things a kid learns about prime old men is they don't put up with any kind of nonsense. Included in the vast store of things that Mr. Hooker considers nonsense were complaints, all of which he defined as whining, or maybe the occasion bawling like a calf. Consequently, when Mr. Hooker would take me out to the cold winter days to check his trap line along Sand Creek, I would keep my complaints corked up until I could stand it no longer. Then I would articulate them in the form of scientific hypothesis. I wonder what happens when a person's toes freeze plumb solid, I would say. Well, when they gets warm again, they just thaws out, Mr. Hooker would reply, splattering a square yard of snow with tobacco juice. Then they falls off. I would respond to the news in a manner of appropriate indifference, as though I were unacquainted with anyone whose toes were at that moment in just such a predicament. Then Mr. Hooker would abruptly change the subject. Say, Bub, he would ask me, I ever show you how to build a fire in the snow? A couple times, I would reply, but I certainly wouldn't mind seeing it again. Then Mr. Hooker would make a few magical motions with his feet and hands, and there would be a bare spot on the ground with a pile of sticks in it. He would snap the head of a kitchen match with his thumbnail, and before I knew what was happening, we would be warming ourselves over a roaring fire, eating dried apricots, and talking of crows. I couldn't begin to relate all the things I learned from Mr. Hooker, but maybe one will suffice. Even though he was in his late 70s and early 80s during the time I knew him, he always insisted on climbing to the top of the mountain in back of our place to pick huckleberries. He taught me that the best huckleberries always grow on the top of the mountain. They weren't any bigger or sweeter, more plentiful up there than huckleberries growing in lower elevations. They were the best because they grew on top of the mountain. Some people may not understand that. If they don't, it's because they never had an old man teach it to them. The winter I was a senior in high school, Mr. Hooker almost died. It made him pretty dang mad, too, because he still had some things he wanted to do. I could imagine death coming timidly into Mr. Hooker's hospital room, and the old man giving him a tongue lashing. You gold-darn old fool! You have come too soon. I ain't even used to it all up yet. He lived to greet another spring, run a cutthroat trout up Sand Creek. I was away at college the following winter when I got the word that Mr. Hooker had at last used it all up. By the time I got home, the funeral was over and the relatives had come and gone, paying their last respects and dividing amongst themselves his meager belongings. It would have been nice if they could have given you one of the fishing rods or knife or something, my mother said. I know he would like to have left you something. I decided to snowshoe out into the woods for a while, just to get away from people and hear what the crows had to say about the passing of Mr. Hooker. My 8-year-old nephew, Dilbert, wanted to go along and try out his Christmas skis. Since I don't consider him a people, I said, All right, come on. After we tracked nearly the full length of the old trap line, Dilbert raised an interesting point. What do you suppose happens when a person's toes freeze plumb solid, he said. Well, I said, they just thaws out. Then they gets warm again. Then they falls off. Say, Bub, I ever show you how to build a fire in the snow? That was a good one. What's up, Beck?